Hello. I hope you have gone through the first talk and we'll start the second talk now. And we are going to essentially talk about uh, the evolution of ethos of the Indian subcontinent. In the last lecture, we talked about how the universe was created and when was the earth made, how did life evolve, what was the process of evolution given by Darwin. And then when the humans evolved, and they evolved in Africa, and then they moved to different parts of the world. And we'll start the second talk from there only. Let me put on the screen share. Okay, the second talk is entitled Early India, South Asia, Evolution and Character. You are familiar with this slide, which we showed the last time, that human beings evolved in Africa and then moved to different parts of the world. This arrow shows the movement. And they populated the whole earth. The migration started about 100,000 years ago. And it is said that Indian subcontinent was already occupied by, people were here by 70,000 BC, 70,000 years before today, before present. And then they went to America, South America, Australia, Europe. And roughly the dates are given here. So Homo sapiens, the first modern humans, evolved from their early hominid predecessors between 200 to 300,000 years ago. They developed a capacity for language about 50,000 years ago. That is another thing we talked about last time, that it is believed that about 50,000 years ago, the language started to develop. Okay. Now let's look at the Indian, the South Asian region here. You see the present political map. You have, of course, the major country, India, then you have Afghanistan, Pakistan, Nepal, Bhutan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka. You also have Maldives. And these national boundaries are now fixed. But these used to be in a big flux in ancient India. For example, you see here the empire of Chandragupta Maurya. It covered even beyond Afghanistan. In the Maratha Empire, you have the Mughal Empire. You see how big was the Mughal Empire. And this is at the time when English people left. Then you have India divided into a large number of states or kingdoms. Princely states were there. So the idea to show this is to emphasize that the boundaries that now are more or less fixed were always very fluid. And when we talk about India, we actually talk about the whole region. We are not talking about Afghanistan or Pakistan or India. So whenever I say India in this particular talk, I am talking about this whole of India, which is we can call South Asia now. Okay, and so when people generally talk about ancient India, ancient Indian history, and all that, they always mean South Asian history, South Asian. So we ended the last talk with this slide, which is, this is a timeline, and you have the present here. And writing actually evolved in the subcontinent. It is believed about 500, 600 years before BC. So this tradition is about 2,500 years old. Agriculture began in about 12, 13,000 BC. But before that, you have this huge black box that we talked about the last time. That when humans migrated, came to Indian subcontinent. About 50,000 years ago, it is believed that the humans started to talk, to evolve a language. And after that, they were communicating, they were living their lives, they were contemplating. Gradually, more and more complex contemplation was there. But we really know nothing of this black box. Our written history, again, at the most, goes till about few thousand BC. But this is 50,000 BC. And here, so over this period, this long period, the subcontinent developed its oral tradition, about which I'll talk to you about. Because there was no writing possible, so an oral tradition developed through which the knowledge was passed from generation to generation. And it was passed by means of shlokas and singing that preserved the scriptures. The scriptures means thought, that developed thought, contemplation, and the outcome of that, whatever was that knowledge was preserved. It was Vedas, Ramayana, and Mahabharata epics. They were all preserved in India by oral tradition. From generation to generation, they were transmitted through oral, because they started writing only rather recently. In fact, it is interesting to talk about Al-Biruni here, who came to India in about he came to India in 1017 AD, when Mahmud of Ghazni attacked India. And he was one of the courtiers of the Mahmud of Ghazni, and he came along with him. And then he lived in India for a long time, 13 years, from 1017 to 1030. And then he wrote a book, Tarikh al-Hind, that means History of India, written 1,000 years ago. This book is available in English translation, this book. And anybody who is interested in knowing the ancient Indian ethos must read this book. It's a thick book, about 800-900 pages are there. And but what I wanted to show you here is what he wrote about the oral tradition. So he writes here, I am now exercising myself, being occupied in composing for the Hindus a translation of the books of Euclid and of the Almagest, and dictating to them a treatise on the construction of the astrolabe. So he's bringing the knowledge of Greeks. He's telling Indians about them. And what he writes interestingly here, if the Hindus happen to get some book which does not yet exist amongst them, like Euclid, etc., they set at work to change it into shlokas. So that is the tradition of India, which he's talking about, that not only their own knowledge was preserved in form of shlokas and verses, but whatever they got from outside also, they immediately tried to convert it into shlokas. That had become a habit in India. So they say that India is a very poetic country, because poetry is very, very important here. And in ancient India, they converted everything worthwhile into poetry. And this oral tradition of India, showing the power of rhythm and verses, we should realize here that if you have a sentence or a prose or a thought, you can write it in text form, but you see, it is very difficult to remember it if it is in written text form. And this Indians realized long back. They, of course, there was no writing, so they could not write the thought. So what they did, they converted it to rhythmic verses and recited them. Because you would know that once you sing a particular song or a verse, and you remember it for your whole life. This is the power of rhythm. This is the power of rhyme and verses. So what happened in India? There were gurus and there were shishyas, the students, and they learned the knowledge through these verses, shlokas, and then they repeated it by rote so that they could then transfer it to the next generation. And this tradition actually you can still see in India. There are many schools, especially in South India, where still they learn to recite Vedas by rote. These schools where the teacher recites the verses and then students repeat them many, many times so that they learn it by heart. So, and then chanting techniques are there that ensure that no error occurs in the transmission of the verse from generation to generation. So this is very interesting if you look at the way they chant. For example, if you have a shloka with these 6 words there, A, B, C, D, E, F, just an example here. So they'll chant A, B, C, D, E, F, but then they also chant A, B, B, C, C, D, D, E, repeating one word in the next phrase. And they can also chant like A, B, C, B, C, D, C, D, E, D, E, F. All these techniques are there to learn the chanting. And the idea was that it should not be corrupted, that it should remain pure and transmission should not, because we know that if you just tell a story and people tell the story to each other, very soon the story gets corrupted. So Indians were very sure about that they have to transmit the knowledge from generation to generation, and it was therefore the oral tradition and the chanting techniques were very important. That ensured that the knowledge was transmitted even though there was no writing. In fact, the other name of Vedas, the oldest scriptures in India, they are called Shrutis. Shrutis means something that you learn by hearing. So that is how the knowledge was transmitted. Now we come to the next question. How do we know about prehistoric events and dates and date artifacts? If you find something, some ancient thing, how do you date it? When was it made? And it belonged to which era? And similarly for prehistoric events, there are lots of techniques, and some of these we can just briefly go through. There is a physiochemical technique, which is called radiocarbon dating, through which if you have a sample or an artifact that is of biological origin, it could be bone, it could be wood, it could be anything which has the origin in biology, biological origin, then you can do the dating of that thing, and I'll tell you how it is done. There are also archaeological evidence that when you dig the earth, there are different layers of the earth, and you have to see in which particular layer your artifact has been found, and accordingly it is dated. There is a complex way of doing it, but there is established techniques that archaeologists follow. There is yet another interesting way of dating events, because in India especially, whosoever wrote the scriptures or the epics like Mahabharata and Ramayana, they give a lot of astronomical evidence, references. For example, if they say Lord Rama was born, and then they'll talk about what planetary configuration was there at that time. Where were different planets located at that time? And there are so many references like that in the whole scripture, in Ramayana as well as Mahabharata, that when important events happen, then the writer says, what is the planetary configuration at this time? So now, let's look at these techniques one by one. If you look here, carbon dating, what happens that the carbon dioxide, we take oxygen from the atmosphere and we respire out carbon dioxide. Plants take carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and give up oxygen. Now that carbon dioxide, the carbon in the carbon dioxide is of two specific isotopes. There is a C12, which is bulk of the carbon. About 99% of the carbon is C12. That means it has an atomic number of 12. Okay? But then there is an isotope of carbon, which is C14, which has the same number of protons, but 2 more neutrons. So it becomes, instead of C12, it becomes C14. And C14 is a radioactive material which decays. It gives a beta particle, that is the electron, and get converted into nitrogen 14. Okay. Now, and then there is the decay of C14 happens like this. That there is a half-life which is about 5,730 years. So in 5,730 years, the amount of C14 that you have would become exactly half. Now in next 5,730 years, it will become again half of the half. So that is the decay. Decay occurs like this. If it is 100 years, it becomes, after one half-life, it becomes 50. Another half-life, it becomes 25. Another half-life, it becomes 12.5, so on and so forth. So now if you can estimate in a sample how much of C14 is remaining in the sample, and you can do it by measuring the beta rays emitted by the sample. And so when this particular artifact was made, when suppose a particular animal was living, then his C14 and C12 were in the ratio which is prevalent in the nature. But after the organism died, the animal died, and what will happen in the bone? All the carbon would start, C14 will decay. And if you can estimate how much of this decay has taken place, then you can calculate back when that sample was alive. Okay? So now if you find that 100% of the carbon 14 is there, that means it's a very recent sample. It is, age is 0. It is just very recent. So if you take, for example, a piece of bone from a recent bone from an animal, or you take a piece of plant and you do the C14, you find that the ratio of C14 to C12 is exactly the same as in the nature. So it is a absolutely fresh sample. But if you find that 50% of the carbon 14 has depleted, then you can say that the age of the sample is 5,730 years, because that is the half-life of C14. If 25% of C14 is remaining, then the age of the sample is 11,460 years, so on and so forth. So carbon dating is a very powerful technique, that if you have samples like bone and plants and animal residues, then you can calculate, you can date the samples by looking at the residual C14 in the sample. Okay. There are other techniques also, but this is a very prominent, important technique. Now let's go to the next one, archaeological dating. And there is this law of superposition. The law states that the strata that are younger will be deposited on top of strata that are older. So then there are layers and layers of strata in the earth. Okay, this is the most recent, this is very, very old. And when you find a particular artifact in a particular layer, for example, here or here, then, the accumulated knowledge, we know when that particular layer was formed, and if the particular artifact is present in that layer, then how old it is expected to be. Okay, so this is the archaeological dating by looking at in which layer of the earth, subsoil, do you find the sample. And this is what I was talking about, astronomical references in Ramayana and Mahabharata. Now let's take an example. Suppose there is an event A, and the scriptures or the epics tell that there was a particular planetary configuration A at that time. Then after a certain number of years that are specified, they talk about another event and again talk about planetary configuration at that. And similarly, so on and so forth. So there are many events. They are, there is defined period between them. And 1 year, and 2 years, and 3 years, and 4 years. So this, now, if you look at, now we have software, astronomical software, that will tell you when in the past an event like A, the planetary configuration A, could occur. And there could be thousands of such possibilities. Okay. Similarly, there could be thousands of possibilities for B, for configuration C, configuration D. But you see, when you look in the software, that when these configurations occurred at these differences of time, so many years, so it becomes a very unique kind of a combination. That this is unlikely that this kind of a combination would have repeated many, many times. Okay. So this is a very interesting way of really finding out when did those events actually happen. Okay, you look at the planetary configuration information from references given in Ramayana and Mahabharata or other epics or other scriptures, and then feed them into computer and let computer tell you that when such combination of events would have taken place. Okay, now it says here that in Mahabharata, there are about 250 such astronomical references. Okay, and like planetary positions, solar and lunar eclipses they talk about. So all these references are there, which you can feed into computer. And using that nowadays, lots of people have tried to date when could Mahabharata have happened, when could Ramayana have happened. And this is something which is not as yet totally accepted. But there are many different people have different views on that, and they come out with dates, which is interesting to note. For example, this particular calculation done by a well-known researcher, Nilesh Oak, and he has given the dates of Ramayana and Mahabharata like this: that Mahabharata occurred 5,561 BC, and Ramayana occurred 12,200 BC. Now these are way far, way behind, way before what is the general wisdom. In general, people think about Ramayana and Mahabharata happening between, let's say, 3000 BC to 2000 BC. But there are no really good evidence for actually any of these dates. But what I meant to tell you, because there are no archaeological evidence, there are some which I'll talk about. But by astronomical internal references, these epics turn out to be very, very old. Okay? Now, you know that Ramayana, and these are huge epics. Ramayana has 10,000 verses, and Mahabharata has 100,000 verses. So if you start reading 10 verses every day, It'll take you 30 years to complete Mahabharata. It's such a huge piece of work. And by internal references put into the software, you come to a date of 5500 BC, has been calculated by Nilesh Oak. But there are other workers, they have given slightly different dates. And again, I'll ask you, keep in mind that these are not established dates. But I think what from our discussion point of view, we should realize that we said that language started 50,000 years ago. And between 50,000 years and our present time, or let's say the written history started maybe say 1000 BC. So about 47,000 years we know nothing. And events could have occurred at any time. Oral tradition would be passing on these information from generation to generation without telling us when did it happen. Okay? And so these are the kind of ways that people can have some idea about, at least make a hypothesis, how old are these events. So in a sense, we are saying here that Indian cultural ethos evolved over thousands and thousands of years. It would have started forming very soon after people started the language. Once they have the language, they will talk, they will contemplate, and gradually the complexity of their thinking will increase. And then all this is being passed by gradually by oral tradition. So you can imagine the kind of Indian ethos that evolved over a very, very long time. Now, the oldest scripture, they say, for India is the Rig Veda. Okay, and Rig Veda names many localities within the Rig Vedas, and these are the localities that it mentions. So that gives us the idea where Vedas were written. This could be the area in which it was written, because all these places find mention in Vedas. Okay, now the kind of knowledge Vedas have is mind-boggling at times. For example, I've given you 3 examples here, verses from shlokas from Rig Veda, 3.5.59.1 Rig Veda shloka, that says this in Sanskrit. In translated into English, it says, "Sun with his attracting power force is holding this earth and the other celestial bodies." Now we know that gravity in the modern science was invented by Newton, but this is thousands of years before Newton. Rig Veda says that the sun attracts and holds earth and other planetary bodies. The other shloka says all the celestial bodies, planets, are moving in elliptical orbits. It's amazing to contemplate that at a time when there were no scientific instruments, only by their thought and observation, they could conclude like this. And here the third one example that I've given, that says, Moon being the subplanet of Earth is revolving around its motherly planet, which is the Earth, and Earth is revolving around its fatherly planet, Sun. This is something which in modern science is a concept which came very, very recently. But in Rig Veda, these are very clearly enunciated. Okay? So whenever we look at a particular finding in modern science, we should not always conclude that nothing of this was known in the prehistory. Because I think what we can discover in these books at times is mind-boggling. The education in the Indian subcontinent started very early. There were a large number of universities were established, and we can talk here about the very old one, the Takshila University, which dates from 1000 BC to 500 BC. It was destroyed. It stayed for about 500 years and was destroyed later on. And it is located in today's Pakistan near Islamabad. And this is a artist view of the university from the, you see, there are ruins of the university which are there. And from that, there is an artist version of the university would have looked at that time. The Takshila University was founded 1000 BC. It was a great learning center for Hindus and Buddhists. And it was said, it is said, was named after Takshak, the son of Bharat. In Mahabharata, in Ramayana, Bharat is the younger son of a younger brother of Rama, and his son's name was Takshak. So maybe Takshila University, the name has come from there. You can also see the importance of the university that Chanakya, the famous economist Arthashastri, he wrote his Arthashastra. This is available even today. Chanakya Arthashastra was written in Nalanda University. And King Chandragupta Maurya and the physician Charak we are going to talk a bit more about, they all studied in Takshila University. And Panini, the great grammarian who wrote the Sanskrit grammar, was also alumni of the Takshila University. This was a very important university, very ancient university. There is no parallel in world history of institutions like this anywhere in the world at that time. Now, Takshila was not the only university. We have a large number of universities. We have Nalanda University, which is in Bihar, and the dates are given here. Takshila, we have already talked about, 500 BC. Vikramshila University in Bihar, Vallabhi University in Saurashtra, Somapura University, which is now in Bangladesh, Jagaddala University also in Bangladesh, now present Bangladesh. Ancient, you see, as I told you, that in ancient India, this was all India. There were no individual countries at that time. The other universities in Bihar and Pushpagiri University in Orissa. You see, you look at the timeline here. You find that generally this whole phase stopped somewhere around 1200, 1400 AD. All the universities were destroyed by the invaders. India has so many invasions coming from its northern frontiers. And these people who invaded India destroyed these universities, and we only have their ruins that we have now. Nonetheless, what is important to note that the tradition of education and learning and creation of knowledge is very, very old in India. With so many universities in the country at that time. Now, we should talk a little bit about Indus Valley civilization, which is about the northwest India. It's a huge area where when they dug out, they found the evidence for one of the most ancient civilizations of human beings in this part of the world. Now, civilization is a word that comes from city-state. We know that agriculture started somewhere around maybe 15,000 BC. There were rural communities everywhere. But then there were some city-states that came up. And from there, we can say when the city-states came, we talk about civilization. Okay, so it happened in Egypt, very old civilization. Egyptian civilization is about 5,000, 6,000 BC. They have evidence for that. Mesopotamia is also equally old. And then Indian civilization, the Indus Valley civilization, is also very old. There are many foci, many loci that people have dug up. They are in Mohenjo-daro, Harappa. These are the sites which are in present-day Pakistan. Rakhi Gadi and Meher Gadi also in Pakistan. It dates back to about 7,000 BC. These are all part of the Indus Valley civilization. And these are some of the artifacts, popular artifacts, well-known artifacts. The priest that been dug out, of the dancing girl, or the bullock cart, a toy bullock cart, and many seals. And you see here the Indus script, which has not yet been deciphered. We don't know what is written here, but you can appreciate the artistic nature of the seal, how beautifully they have made this particular organism. So, therefore, even by archaeological evidence, we have evidence for up to 7,000 BC within Indus Valley civilization. And we don't have time to go into what were the characteristics of this civilization. You can just Google it and read about it. Uh, but what has importantly happened recently, and about a few years ago, was an excavation in a place, in a village called Sinoli, which is near Delhi, near Meerut actually, near Bagpat. Bagpat is a city that you have in Haryana. And Bagpat actually, interestingly, was one of the villages that Pandavas had asked for from Kauravas, from Duryodhan, that to avoid the war, give us 5 villages. And one of the villages was Bagpat. Okay. So now in the excavation in Sinoli recently, they found these kind of artifacts. The skeletal remains of warriors, both women and men. Their swords that they used, and very interestingly, the chariot. And this, the date, Sinoli has been dated to about 4,000 years from today. That is about 2,000 years BC. Okay, so this is actually quite a quantum jump in our knowledge about India, because so far, in none of the excavations, these kind of chariots, weapons, this is a drawing of chariot, how it would have looked like. So these were used by warriors, like for example in Mahabharata war. These kind of chariots would have been used. And as I told you, it is dated to about 2000 BC. The chariots are driven by horses. And this is the important point which is being debated nowadays, that it was said before the Sinoli excavation that in India, there were no horses that existed before, let's say, 1000 BC. And they say in about 1000 BC, a tribe of Aryans came to India and populated the country. And they brought along with them Vedas, which was their scriptures, and they brought with them horses. The reason for them saying that is because in Vedas, there is a lot of mention of horses. They refer to horses as Manita. But in none of the Indus Valley civilization sites, they could find evidence for a horse. So then they concluded that maybe Aryans came from outside, bring their horses, bring their Vedas, and then populated this part of the world. But then Sinoli excavation shows that before the Aryans came, like about 1000 BC or so, that there were already chariots and maybe horses which were present. So I think it's a debate which is going on, and nothing is established as yet. But it tells us something about how the civilization progressed in India. Now, let's take some points, what we have discussed so far and what we are going to discuss, some attributes of the ancient Indian culture. Now, we should be clear in our mind, the ancient Indian culture evolved over several thousands of years, and I would think that probably started soon after the language was developed, about 50,000 years BC. So we simply don't have evidence, but all these knowledge, etc., was really composed in that period. And even Indian thought got shaped in this period. So we can write here memorizing wisdom in absence of writing, because they could not write, so they memorized by converting the knowledge into poetry and shlokas and sutras. And then they preserved the transmission of wisdom by oral tradition. Sanskrit grammar, that language was, Sanskrit was so evolved thousands of years ago that finally in about 500 BC, a Sanskrit grammar was written by a great scholar called Panini. We'll talk about Panini a bit later. But this is considered to be a masterpiece. His book on grammar is a masterpiece in evolution of languages, and we'll talk a little bit more about it. There was a very strong tradition of mathematics in India. And we'll refer to that tradition again. The number system and invention of zero as a number was made in India. The trigonometry and calculus elements are there in Indian mathematicians' thinking and their writing. Lot of knowledge of astronomy. You can imagine when during writing of Mahabharata and Ramayana, when they give the configuration of planets, you can imagine how advanced their knowledge was, that by observation they could place which planet is where and all that. And of course, metallurgy is another very strong point in Indian. So we knew how to forge iron, for example, and we'll talk about this briefly later. Now, Panini and the Sanskrit grammar, which was written about 500 BC, as I told you, that probably at Takshila University, Panini wrote this book, Ashtadhyayi. Ashtadhyayi means a book with 8 chapters. And Ashtadhyayi composed in the Sutra style. There is a very popular style in Indian scripture which is called Sutra. And sutras are small phrases. They write only the phrases as a aid to the memory. And later on, a guru will expand on that sutra. He will explain to the student what that sutra meant. So many of, like, for example, Patanjali Sutra is Yoga Sutra, or the Panini's Ashtadhyayi, these are all sutras. So it is not detailed explanations, but they have sutras which the teachers have to further elaborate on. 4,000 sutras are there in Ashtadhyayi that capture the fundamentals of Sanskrit language in terms of its phonology, morphology, and syntax. Okay, one of the oldest manuscripts is given here. So this was a great achievement by Indian scholars to analyze the language in such great fine analysis and write a very detailed grammar of the language. Okay. So now we should talk about Aryabhatta, which is about 500 AD. He was a genius mathematician and astronomer, and his contributions are tremendous. You know, he could explain the lunar eclipse and solar eclipse. So he could explain that lunar eclipse actually is the shadow of Earth on Moon. The solar eclipse is actually Moon coming in between Sun and Earth. That at a time when there was no concept, but they had a concept, as I told you, in Rig Veda itself, they said that there are the planets move around the Sun, and then Moon rotates around the Earth. Then Aryabhatta wrote about the rotation of Earth on its own axis. And he also wrote about reflection of light by Moon. That Moon doesn't have its own light. It's a reflection from the sunlight. And the sine function, actually a lot of trigonometry that Aryabhatta wrote, and solution of single variable quadratic equations, which came from Aryabhatta gave solutions for these equations, and he could calculate the value of pi correct to 4 decimal places. Pi, you know, is the ratio between the diameter of a circle to its circumference. Okay, so that ratio he calculated very, very accurately. He also gave the diameter of Earth, Sun, and planets. It is amazing. How did he do it? Distance between Sun and Earth, and these are very accurate estimates. These are not way off estimates. They're very, very close to the modern realities. And even at that time, when you could barely see Saturn in the sky, he wrote about 7 satellites of Saturn. So this is mind-boggling, really. And 7 days of a week, you know, the names of the days were given by Aryabhatta. And then solar and lunar eclipses he defined. So much was the contribution of Aryabhatta. You can Google and read about him in that period. Actually, the first satellite that Indian space program sent was named Aryabhatta on the name of this genius. The concept of zero and decimal system was evolved in India. A lot of contribution of Aryabhatta in that. You can read this slide later, but It's very interesting how zero as a number was invented by Indian mathematicians. Actually, here is a written document which survives today, which is called Bhaksali manuscript and has been dated from 3rd to 7th century AD by carbon dating. Okay, and this particular manuscript actually shows zero being used. This is probably one of the most ancient use of zero. The way these numbers have been used like this, and zero as this was used like this, zero in this manuscript. So therefore, India has made a tremendous contribution to mathematics and mathematical thinking by giving the numeral system, the decimal system, and the zero as a number. There was a lot of work done in India on measurements. And of course, the motivation was perhaps designing buildings or designing Vedis for puja, So, and they made very, very complicated designs. And they could precisely measure, various dimensions in this diagram. And this was used. So this is called Sulba Sutra from Bodhayan, Science of Measurement. And this word of earliest systematic treatise on geometric sciences was Sulba Sutra. Okay. And it contains pre-existing ideas from more ancient Vedic works that date back to 2000 to 3000 BC. You can see that how much people were aware of not only numbers, decimal system, trigonometry and all, but they could do very fine calculations of areas and measurements of the building or Vedi to be made. Again, this is a very interesting example of Bhaskara, another mathematician. And this actually combines the love of Indians for poetry and love of Indians for mathematics. And Bhaskara wrote for his daughter Lilavati many riddles, and they are all in verses. So it is given here. So the question is posed in a verse. And you can read this question here. 1/5 of a swarm of bees flew away towards a lotus flower, 1/3 towards a banana tree. So you see, it is described a riddle. Then tell me what is the answer. And you can calculate it in this way and come to the answer. If the answer of the riddle is, it's 15. So this is a combination of our love for mathematics and our love for poetry that you can see in this book, Lilavati. This is again something which has recently come up, that in, you should keep in mind the Sanskrit manuscripts, ancient manuscript, there is a whole lot of them, maybe millions of them, which have not yet been read. So it is actually a huge exercise which is required to actually read those things and write down what are they saying, and in order to understand the thinking at that time. There is a book which is called Agastya Samhita, written by the Rishi Agastya, and it is probably before 7th century AD. That is the time. And in this shloka here, Agastya tells it about how to make a battery. And he really says that take a earthen pot, clean it up, and put in it, copper sulfate, which had a particular name at that time. Put copper plate here, and then put wet wooden shavings, wet sawdust here, and then come with a layer of zinc coated mercury. And he said, if you do that, and if you combine them, you will generate electricity. The name for electricity, they say, Mitra Varuna Shakti. So they were aware of electricity generated in a cell. Okay, discovery of electricity, Mitra Varuna Shakti, as they call it, before 7th century AD. And this is a statue of Agastya, which is dated 12th century from Bihar. Actually, he is very popular in Southeast Asian countries. And in Cambodia, for example, there are other statues here found of Agastya. And it is very interesting to know that they had the knowledge of how to generate electricity at that time. We think that ancient people knew nothing. In fact, the modern invention of battery is only very recent, maybe 150 years old. But then, way back, thousands of years ago, we have the knowledge here described so beautifully in Agastya Samhita, how to make a battery. Okay. Similarly, metallurgy and chemistry. There are many books written by Nagarjuna about 950 AD, okay, which he talks about. These are the books he has written. And sometimes we don't know whether it's the same Nagarjuna, maybe there are many Nagarjunas. But anyway, these books are available, which have a lot of knowledge about how to extract silver, gold, tin, and copper to the metallurgy, and how to make iron. Okay, he was actually, interestingly, because of his profound scholarliness and versatile language, Nagarjuna was also appointed vice chancellor as chancellor of the famous University of Nalanda. So, that is the time. And then that knowledge existed of extraction, how to take out the ores, make metal out of it, make different alloys and all that. And you have a very good example of that in this particular iron pillar that you see in Delhi Qutub Minar. Iron pillar in Qutub Minar has resisted rusting for 1600 years. Just imagine. You leave a iron nail outside and very soon it starts rusting and very soon it will be gone. But this pillar, which is about 1,600 years old, 1,600 years old, is still existing without any sign of rusting. And then there are inscriptions on the pillar. Okay. Now let's read here. The iron pillar of Delhi is a structure 23 feet 8 inches high with 16 inches diameter that was constructed by a King Chandra, probably Chandragupta II, and now stands in Qutub Complex in Mehrauli in Delhi. It is famous for the rust resistance composition of the metal used in the construction. Now, mind you, the pillar does not belong to this particular place. It was brought here and erected here by later invaders. But this pillar's average composition is 0.15% carbon. And all these different elements. How was it made? They had the technology, which we do not know, but they have this technology to make rust-proof iron at that time. In the field of medicine, India had made very important contributions. And one of the most famous surgeons of Indian origin is Sushruta, who was a part of the Takshila University, where he taught medicine. And a medical treatise called Sushruta Samhita, 6th century BC, describes 1,120 illnesses, 700 medicinal plants, a detailed study on anatomy, 64 preparations from mineral sources, and 57 preparations based on animal sources. Now, cataract surgery was known to ancient Indians. Sushruta did these cataract surgeries by pushing the lens within the eye. So actually Sushruta is called father of surgery, not only for India, but for the whole world. He has described surgical instruments. If you do Google, you will find a large number of surgical instruments that he designed. And many of the techniques that he used, especially in plastic surgery. In ancient India, a common punishment used to cut the nose of a person. And Sushruta developed a technique to reconstitute the nose by taking a flap of skin from the forehead. And that technique is still used today. The Sushruta's technique for plastic surgery is used for various kind of reconstitutions that even today. Okay. Similarly, Charak was a physician 100 to 200, 100 BC to 200 AD. That was about the time. And we have the Charak Sanhita that is available, if not complete, but part of the books. And it talks about ancient theories on human body, etiology, symptoms, therapeutics for a wide range of diseases. And he talked about diet, hygiene, prevention, medical education, and teamwork of physicians, nurses. So, this tradition of medicine is very old in India. Now let's summarize. There are a few very famous books on India which you can read. One of them is a very famous book, The Wonder That Was India. The title of the book, The Wonder That Was India, by A.L. Bhashan, a very scholarly figure who has written this thick volume. And some statements that he makes here, there, I've written there, I can present it here. Our overall impression is that in no other part of the ancient world were there the relations of man and the man and that of man and the state were so humane as in India. In no other earthly civilizations were slaves so few. We had hardly any slaves in our history. In numbers, and in no other ancient law books are their rights so well defined, so well protected as in Arthashastra. No other lawgiver proclaimed such noble ideas of fair play in a battle as did Manu. India had few tales to tell about cities put to sword, that mass massacres, or the massacre of the non-combatants. In general, there are no such mass killing exercises recorded, talked about. In the war they fought. There was the Mahabharata war, they fought. But they had fought with full ethics that a person who is not armed cannot be harmed. And people, in fact, it is said that when Mahabharata war was going on, the citizens used to stand on the periphery and watch it without fear that somebody will kill them, because that was against the rule of wars. To us, the most striking feature of ancient Indian civilization is its humanity. Similarly, the other great author, Will Durant, he has written a 12-volume book, The History of Civilizations. For the whole world, actually, he has written. He got a Pulitzer Prize for that book. And then he wrote a specific book. In that particular book, History of Civilization, there is a book, part of it is dedicated to ancient India. And then he wrote a separate book, The Case for India. And some of these statements are here. India was the motherland of our race, Indo-European race. And Sanskrit, the mother of European languages and of our philosophy. India was mother, therefore, through Arabs, of much of our mathematics. India was mother through Buddha, of ideas embodied in Christianity. India was mother through village communities of self-governance and democracy. And Mother India is in many ways the mother of us all. So this Indian civilization, therefore, we are only starting to understand this. There is a lot to be discovered, but it was a civilization that was unparalleled in its humanity, in its knowledge, and in its quests, there are questions that it raised. So let's go look at this one. This is a timeline that I have drawn here. This is a timeline. And you have 50,000 BC when the languages started to evolve. And then you can say roughly in 17th century, the modern science started, growth of modern science. But in between the period, a human mind always poses questions. But of course, there was no way to answer these questions because the systematic study of science only started very recently. So we can roughly, therefore, divide the eras into era A, which is the era where there was no language, and human beings and our predecessors were just like other animals. So they had instincts, as I told you in the last lecture, that instincts are passed by genes. So we have all those instincts, the emotions, the flight or fight mechanisms, all those things which are required for survival evolved before this time. After the language developed, then the questions started uh, being asked because they had a language, they could now ask questions. So what developed in this period were imaginations, myth, rituals, religion, knowledge from meditation and oral traditions. All this period. And then, of course, you have the period C, where the science developed and then started giving concrete answers to many of the questions. Okay, so the period in between this period that I marked here, was where the myths developed, the rituals, the religion, knowledge from meditation, oral traditions, etc. Keep this in mind that overall, how do we look at the past? So we look at the past as a phase that was older than 50,000 BC, which is the annual-like phase where our instincts evolved. And then the next phase where our ethos evolved. And now the phase of modern science. So era A, which is really called pre-neocortex, because in the last lecture we talked about the brain getting the neocortex. But before the neocortex developed, we have the era A where there was no language. But what developed in this area was instincts and deep urges. Procreation, urge, sex, aggression, maternal instincts, search for food. They are all encoded in genes. Okay? And these are very, very strong instincts, powerful forces. We talk about the crime of passions. All these passions were generated, were encoded in our genes in era A, when this was the animal phase, when all these instincts developed, and now even today we have them through our genes. Then era B, after the language developed, which we call post-neocortical, that neocortex had developed the present level. We have a huge neocortex, which will allow us to refine our language, refine our thoughts. And this was a time when cultural ethos of India developed. Our traditions, rituals, religion, values, morals, yoga and meditation, and the whole thing about seekers of truth and oral tradition, all this happened in next phase, which was era B, we'll call them. And that is up to roughly to the time when the modern science started to develop. So I think this is what I want to talk to you in this particular talk. We will now continue in the next talk and talk about the modern science. That how did the modern science come into being, and where are we now, and what is there in future, which is there for what is the future of the humanity in view of where we are today. Thank you very much.